Good evening, brave souls. Tonight we venture into a tale of terror that will grip your heart and haunt your dreams. The scorching sun hung low over the Egyptian desert, casting long shadows across the golden sands. The air was thick with heat, and the only sounds were the occasional whisper of the wind and the distant calls of desert birds. But for the group of archaeologists standing on the banks of the Nile, the heat and the desolation were secondary to the excitement that buzzed in the air. They had discovered something extraordinary, a hidden tomb untouched by time, buried deep beneath the sands, near the ancient city of Thebes. Dr. Amelia Carter, the lead archaeologist, had devoted her life to uncovering the secrets of ancient Egypt. She was a woman of determination, with sharp eyes and a mind that never stopped working. This discovery was the culmination of years of research, of long days spent poring over ancient texts, and nights spent dreaming of the treasures that lay hidden beneath the sands. And now, as she stood at the entrance to the tomb, she felt a thrill of anticipation. The tomb's entrance was small, barely large enough for a person to crawl through, but Amelia knew that it led to something much larger. She could feel it in her bones. As she and her team worked to clear away the sand and debris, the opening slowly widened, revealing a dark passage that seemed to stretch on forever. "Are you sure about this, Dr. Carter?" one of her assistants, Samir, asked, his voice tinged with nervousness. He was young, eager to learn, but the tales of curses and spirits that haunted the ancient tombs had clearly unnerved him. Amelia smiled, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "There's nothing to worry about, Samir. We've prepared for this. It's just another tomb, like the others we've explored." But deep down, Amelia knew this tomb was different. There was an energy here, a presence that she couldn't quite put her finger on. It was as if the tomb was waiting for them, as if it had been sealed away for a reason. But Amelia was not one to be deterred by superstition. She was here for knowledge, for discovery, and nothing would stand in her way. As the team ventured deeper into the tomb, the air grew cooler, the walls closing in around them. The narrow passageway finally opened into a vast chamber, the walls lined with hieroglyphs that told stories of gods and pharaohs, long forgotten by time. In the center of the chamber stood a massive stone sarcophagus, its lid sealed shut with a thick layer of dust. Amelia's heart raced as she approached the sarcophagus, her fingers brushing over the ancient carvings. The hieroglyphs were worn, but she could still make out the name of the one entombed here. Neferkara, a name she had seen only in obscure texts. He had been a priest of Amun, a powerful figure in his time. But his name had been erased from history, his tomb hidden away as if to keep something contained. "There's no record of this tomb," Amelia murmured, her eyes scanning the hieroglyphs. Neferkara was supposed to have been buried in Thebes, but this is something entirely different. Why would they hide his tomb out here, so far from the city? Samir asked, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Amelia shook her head. "I don't know, but we're going to find out." With great care, the team worked to lift the lid of the sarcophagus. The stone groaned under the strain, the ancient seals breaking with a soft hiss. As the lid slid off, a cloud of dust rose into the air, and Amelia took a step back, holding her breath. The chamber fell silent as the dust settled, revealing the mummified remains of Neferkara, wrapped in layers of linen that had long since turned to dust. But there was something else, something that made Amelia's blood run cold. Resting on the chest of the mummy was a small, intricately carved amulet, shaped like an ankh. It was made of a dark, glossy stone, its surface smooth and cold to the touch. As Amelia reached out to examine it, a voice echoed through the chamber, soft and distant, like a whisper carried on the wind. "Leave." Amelia froze, her hand hovering above the amulet. She glanced at her team, but they were all staring at her, their faces pale. They had heard it too. "Did you hear that?" Samir whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Amelia nodded slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. But she was a scientist, and she refused to be swayed by fear. "It's just the wind," she said, though even she didn't believe it. She reached out again, this time grasping the amulet in her hand. The moment her fingers closed around it, the temperature in the chamber dropped sharply, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent. "Leave this place, or suffer the curse of Neferkara." Amelia's hand trembled as she held the amulet, its cold surface seeming to pulse in her grip. But she couldn't let go. There was something about the amulet, something that called to her, that urged her to uncover its secrets. Ignoring the growing fear in her chest, she slipped the amulet into her pocket and turned to her team. "Let's get this documented and catalogued," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We'll take the amulet back to camp for further study." But as they made their way back through the passage, the air seemed to press in around them, the walls closing in tighter with each step. The whispering followed them, growing louder, more desperate, until it was a constant roar in Amelia's ears. By the time they emerged into the sunlight, the entire team was on edge. They worked quickly to document the find, but the unease lingered, and by nightfall, the camp was tense with fear. That night, as Amelia sat in her tent, examining the amulet under the dim light of a lantern, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The whispers had followed her from the tomb, though now they were faint, barely audible above the rustling of the wind. But they were there, growing louder with each passing hour. She tried to focus on the amulet, on the intricate carvings that lined its surface. There was something written there, something she hadn't noticed before. The symbols were ancient, older than any hieroglyphs she had ever seen, and as she traced them with her finger, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. Suddenly, the lantern flickered and went out, plunging the tent into darkness. Amelia's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. The whispers were all around her now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from every direction. "Return the amulet, or face the wrath of Neferkara." Amelia's hands shook as she fumbled for the lantern, trying to relight it. But the matches slipped from her fingers, and as she reached down to pick them up, a cold hand closed around her wrist. She gasped, yanking her hand back. But there was nothing there. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed down on her like a weight. She could feel something in the darkness, something ancient and powerful, watching her, waiting for her next move. She grabbed the amulet and ran from the tent, her heart racing as she stumbled through the darkened camp. She had to get rid of it, had to return it to the tomb before it was too late. The whispering had started again, growing louder with each step she took, urging her to go back, to return what she had stolen. But as she reached the edge of the camp, she froze. Standing in the shadows, barely visible in the moonlight, was a figure, tall and cloaked in darkness. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, piercing through the night like twin orbs of fire. "Return the amulet," the figure whispered, its voice echoing in Amelia's mind. "Or face the curse of Neferkara." Amelia's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the figure, the amulet clutched tightly in her hand. She knew then that she had made a terrible mistake. The stories were true. The curse was real. And if she didn't return the amulet, she would suffer the same fate as those who had come before her. With shaking hands, She dropped the amulet at the figure's feet and took a step back. The figure bent down, its cold, bony fingers closing around the amulet as it straightened up. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the whispers fading into silence. Then, without a word, the figure turned and disappeared into the night, taking the amulet and the curse back to the tomb where it belonged. Amelia collapsed to her knees, the weight of the curse lifted from her shoulders. She had narrowly escaped the wrath of Neferkara, but the experience had left her shaken, her once unshakable resolve shattered as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. Amelia knew that she would never forget what had happened in the tomb. The curse of the Whisperer of the Nile was real, and she had come face to face with it. From that day forward, she swore to respect the ancient tombs, to leave their secrets buried beneath the sands where they belonged. For some things were never meant to be uncovered, and the whispers of the past were best left to the wind. The desert sun beat down on Dr. Miriam Hayes as she stood at the entrance of the newly discovered tomb. For years, she had dreamed of this moment, a chance to uncover the mysteries of ancient Egypt. The inscription on the entrance warned of a curse, but Miriam, a skeptic at heart, brushed it off as superstition. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of old stone. The walls were lined with intricate hieroglyphs telling stories of gods and pharaohs long forgotten. Miriam's assistant, Tom, was by her side, his flashlight casting eerie shadows as they ventured deeper into the tomb. "Are you sure we should be doing this?" Tom asked, his voice trembling slightly. Miriam smiled, her excitement barely contained. "This is the find of the century, Tom. We're making history." They reached the burial chamber, where a massive stone sarcophagus lay in the center. The lid was adorned with the likeness of a pharaoh, his eyes closed as if in eternal slumber. Miriam's heart raced as she approached the sarcophagus, her fingers brushing over the ancient carvings. "This is it," she whispered, awestruck. With a deep breath, she signaled Tom to help her lift the lid. It took all their strength, but finally the lid slid open, revealing the mummified remains of the pharaoh. His wrappings were pristine, as if untouched by time, and on his chest rested a golden amulet shaped like an ankh. Miriam's eyes widened in wonder. "This is incredible." But as she reached out to touch the amulet, a sudden gust of wind blew through the chamber, extinguishing their flashlights. The room was plunged into darkness, and a low, guttural sound echoed around them. "Did you hear that?" Tom whispered, fear creeping into his voice. Before Miriam could respond, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The hieroglyphs on the walls glowed faintly, casting an eerie light. From the shadows, a figure emerged, a tall, imposing figure, wrapped in ancient bandages. The mummy's eyes glowed with an unnatural light as it stepped toward them, its movements slow but deliberate. Miriam's heart pounded in her chest. She backed away, her mind racing. The curse. It couldn't be real, could it? "Tom!" "Run!" she shouted, but her voice seemed to fall flat in the oppressive darkness. The mummy reached out, its hand inches from Miriam's face. She stumbled back, her foot catching on a loose stone. She fell, hitting the ground hard, the air knocked from her lungs. The mummy loomed over her, its gaze fixed on the amulet still clutched in her hand. Desperation took over. Miriam threw the amulet across the room, watching as it clattered against the far wall. The mummy paused, its glowing eyes following the amulet's path. Seizing the moment, Miriam scrambled to her feet and grabbed Tom's arm. "Go!" Now they ran, the echoes of the mummy's footsteps close behind. The walls seemed to close in around them as they fled through the narrow passageways, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Just as they reached the tomb's entrance, the ground shook violently, and the ceiling began to collapse. With one final push, Miriam and Tom dove out of the tomb, landing in the scorching sand as the entrance caved in behind them. They lay there, gasping for breath, the desert sun beating down on them once more. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Tom broke the silence. What was that? Miriam shook her head, her mind still reeling. The curse. It was real. They watched as the last remnants of the tomb disappeared beneath the sand, the ancient secrets buried once again. Miriam knew she had come too close to a force she couldn't comprehend, a force that was better left undisturbed. As they stood and began the long trek back to civilization, the weight of what had happened settled over Miriam like a shroud. She had uncovered the mysteries of ancient Egypt, but at a price she could never have imagined. The desert held its secrets tightly, and now she knew some things were meant to remain hidden. The whispers of the past had spoken, and Miriam would never forget their warning. In the scorching sands of Egypt, beneath the shadow of the Great Pyramids, an ancient secret lay buried. For centuries, it remained hidden, its power unknown to the world. That was until Dr. Amelia Hayes, a renowned archaeologist, stumbled upon a sealed chamber during an excavation in the Valley of the Kings. Inside this chamber, shrouded in darkness, she discovered an artifact that would change her life forever, the Mirror of Ra. The mirror was unlike anything Amelia had ever seen. Its surface was polished to perfection, reflecting the dim light of her lantern with an otherworldly sheen. Intricate hieroglyphs encircled the frame, warning of the sun god Ra's wrath. Despite the warnings, Amelia felt a pull, a compulsion to uncover its secrets. She was a scientist, after all, driven by curiosity and the pursuit of knowledge. As she studied the mirror, Amelia's team grew uneasy. Whispers filled the camp, tales of curses and ancient gods seeking vengeance. But Amelia dismissed their fears as mere superstition. To her, the mirror was an artifact, a relic of the past, nothing more. She was determined to unlock its mysteries. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Amelia found herself alone in her tent, the mirror propped up before her. The rest of the team had retired for the night, but Amelia's mind buzzed with excitement. She ran her fingers over the hieroglyphs, translating them in her head. The Eye of Ra sees all. His wrath burns those who dare defy him. Her heart quickened as she stared into the mirror's surface. For a moment, she saw only her reflection, her own eager eyes staring back at her. But then, something shifted. The reflection blurred, the image distorting as if the mirror itself was alive. The tent around her faded away, replaced by visions of fire and chaos. Amelia gasped as the scenes unfolded before her eyes. She saw ancient cities consumed by flames, their inhabitants fleeing in terror as the sky darkened with smoke. She saw Ra himself, his eyes blazing like twin suns, raining destruction upon the earth. And then she saw herself, standing at the heart of the inferno, her eyes filled with the same fiery wrath. The visions overwhelmed her, searing her mind with their intensity. She tried to look away, but the mirror held her captive. It was as if Ra's power had reached through the ages, binding her to his will. When the visions finally subsided, Amelia was left trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. The mirror's surface was calm once more, but the images lingered in her mind. She felt a burning need, a compulsion to act, as if the mirror had awakened something within her. The following days were a blur. Amelia became obsessed with the mirror, spending hours locked in her tent, gazing into its depths. Her team grew increasingly worried. They noticed the change in her, the way her eyes seemed distant, the way she muttered to herself as if in conversation with something unseen. But Amelia paid them no mind. She was consumed by the visions, by the power of Ra that seemed to flow through her veins. She saw herself as a vessel for the sun god, chosen to carry out his will. The ancient warnings etched into the mirror were no longer threats, but commands that she was compelled to follow. It wasn't long before the compulsion took a darker turn. Amelia began to see her team as obstacles, barriers to Ra's grand design. The visions showed her what she needed to do, and she obeyed without question. One by one, her colleagues met their end. Accidents, the authorities would later call them. Tragic mishaps in the dangerous world of archaeology. But Amelia knew better. She had carried out Ra's will, purging the unworthy from his sight. By the time the authorities arrived at the dig site, Amelia was gone, vanished into the desert with the mirror in tow. The story of the cursed excavation spread quickly, a tale of madness and murder that would become another legend of Egypt's haunted past. But Amelia's story didn't end there. She roamed the desert for days, the mirror her only companion. The visions continued, driving her deeper into the wilderness, away from civilization and into the heart of the sun-scorched Sin. She became a ghost, a phantom haunting the ruins of Egypt, her mind fractured by the power of the mirror. Years passed, and the legend of the Mirror of Ra grew. Locals spoke of a madwoman wandering the desert, her eyes burning with an unnatural light, searching for something or someone. Some claimed to have seen her, their stories filled with fear and dread. But none dared to approach her, for they knew the fate that awaited those who crossed her path. In the end, Amelia's fate became a cautionary tale, a warning to those who sought to uncover the secrets of the past. The Mirror of Ra was lost once more, buried beneath the sands, its power waiting to be unleashed upon the next unsuspecting soul. And so, the cycle continued. The mirror's curse living on, waiting for the day when it would be discovered again, its dark power once more unleashed upon the world. The desert night was quiet, except for the faint rustling of sand against ancient stone. 3 figures moved in the shadows, their faces covered by scarves to shield them from the cold desert wind. They were grave robbers, Amir, Tariq, and Zaid, drawn to the recently discovered tomb of Pharaoh Ankheton. Whispers of treasure and gold had reached their ears, and they couldn't resist the allure of the wealth that lay buried beneath the sands. "This is it," Amir whispered, his eyes wide with greed as they stood before the sealed entrance of the tomb. The stone door was massive, covered in hieroglyphs that warned of a curse placed upon any who disturbed the pharaoh's final resting place. Tariq, the youngest of the group, hesitated. "Maybe we should turn back." The villagers spoke of a curse. They said the pharaoh's spirit would hunt down anyone who dares to steal from him. Amir scoffed, his voice full of contempt. "Curses are just stories to scare away fools. We're here for the treasure, nothing else. Now, help me open this door." With great effort, the 3 men pushed against the stone slab, their muscles straining as it slowly creaked open. A rush of stale air greeted them, carrying with it the scent of decay and something older, something that had been locked away for centuries. Inside, the tomb was dark, the only light coming from their flickering torches. The walls were covered in more hieroglyphs, but none of the men could read them. All they saw were the glittering treasures scattered throughout the chamber, gold coins, jewels, and statues of gods and pharaohs, all waiting to be taken. Zaid, the tallest of the group, grinned as he reached for a golden necklace encrusted with gems. "We're rich." But as his fingers closed around the necklace, a sudden chill filled the air, and the torches flickered ominously. The shadows in the chamber seemed to stretch and twist, forming shapes that shouldn't have been there. "Did you feel that?" Tariq asked, his voice shaking. His eyes darted around the chamber, trying to make sense of the darkness that seemed to move on its own. "Stop being paranoid," Amir snapped, though he, too, felt a cold knot of fear tightening in his chest. He forced himself to focus on the treasure. "Grab what you can. We'll be out of here before sunrise." The men hurriedly filled their bags with as much gold as they could carry, but as they did, the temperature in the tomb dropped further. A low, guttural sound echoed through the chamber, like the moaning of a distant wind or a voice, deep and ancient. Zaid froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. "Did you hear that?" Amir shook his head, refusing to let fear take hold. "Just the wind. Keep moving." But the sound grew louder, more distinct, as if something was moving toward them from the depths of the tomb. The shadows continued to writhe and shift, and now there was no mistaking it. Something was in the tomb with them. A cold breath brushed against Amir's neck, and he spun around, his heart pounding. There was nothing there, just the darkness, stretching endlessly into the unknown. But as he turned back to the treasure, he saw it, a figure, draped in tattered linen, standing at the far end of the chamber. Its eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. "The Pharaoh," Tariq whispered, his voice barely audible as the figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. The torches flickered again, and in their dim light, the men could see the Pharaoh's face, gaunt and hollow, his once regal features twisted with anger and pain. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. "Run!" Amir shouted, but it was too late. As the Pharaoh raised his hand, a wave of darkness washed over them, and the walls of the tomb closed in. The treasure scattered across the floor began to melt away, revealing bones and decayed remains. The hieroglyphs on the walls began to glow, telling the story of Akhenaten's curse, how he had been betrayed by his closest advisors and buried alive in his tomb, doomed to an eternity of suffering. Zaid screamed as the Pharaoh's gaze locked onto him, his body frozen in place as visions filled his mind. Visions of the Pharaoh's death, the pain and betrayal he had endured. The images were so vivid, so real, that Zaid felt the agony as if it were his own. He dropped to his knees, his mind shattered by the visions, and he never rose again. Tariq, too, was overcome by the Pharaoh's wrath. The shadows around him seemed to come alive, wrapping around his limbs and pulling him into the darkness. He struggled, but it was no use. The more he fought, the tighter the shadows became, until they crushed the life out of him. Amir, the last of the group, stumbled backward, his mind racing. He had to escape, had to get out of the tomb before the curse claimed him too. But the entrance, which had once been so close, now seemed impossibly far away. The Pharaoh's voice echoed in his mind, a chorus of whispers that spoke of vengeance and retribution. Amir clutched his head, trying to block out the sound, but it only grew louder, filling every corner of his consciousness. "Please," Amir begged, falling to his knees. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to disturb you." But the Pharaoh showed no mercy. He had waited centuries for this moment, and he would not be denied his vengeance. With a final, deafening roar, the tomb collapsed, burying Amir beneath tons of stone and sand. The desert was silent once more, the tomb sealed away for eternity. The treasure remained hidden, untouched by time, a warning to all who would dare to disturb the resting place of the ancient dead. And in the shadows of the tomb, the Pharaoh waited, his wrath eternal, ready to punish any who would dare to break the seal again. In the shadow of the Great Pyramids, where the sands of time had buried the secrets of ancient Egypt, an ambitious priest named Menes sought the power that had eluded him all his life. He was a man consumed by the desire for eternal life, willing to do anything to escape the clutches of death. For years, Menes had studied forbidden texts and ancient rituals, searching for the secret to immortality. His quest led him to a ritual so dangerous, so powerful, that it had been banished from all records, whispered only in dark corners of temples. One night, under the pale light of a crescent moon, Menes crept into the temple of Anubis, the god of the afterlife. The temple was deserted, its ancient halls silent as the tombs they guarded. Menes carried with him a scroll, brittle with age, that held the incantations needed to perform the ritual. But there was a price. A life had to be given to gain life eternal. Menes had chosen his sacrifice carefully. In the deepest chamber of the temple lay the sarcophagus of Setka, a once powerful pharaoh, whose name had been erased from history. Setka had been feared in life, a ruler of cruelty and darkness. Even in death, his name inspired dread. But to Menes, Setka's forgotten spirit was the perfect vessel for his ambitions. The priest began the ritual, his voice trembling as he recited the ancient words. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of centuries. Candles flickered and died as Menes chanted, the power of the ritual pulling the very light from the room. As he reached the final verse, Menes took a knife and slit his palm, letting his blood drip onto the sarcophagus. The blood seeped into the cracks of the stone, and the ground beneath him began to tremble. The lid of the sarcophagus slid open with a deep grinding sound. Menes peered inside, expecting to see the decayed remains of the pharaoh. But instead he saw Setka's body, perfectly preserved, as if the centuries had not touched him. Menes' heart raced. This was it, the moment he had dreamed of. He reached into the sarcophagus, ready to complete the ritual and claim his reward. But as his hand brushed the pharaoh's chest, Setka's eyes snapped open. Menes stumbled back, horrified. The pharaoh's eyes glowed with a cold, unnatural light, filled with a hatred that transcended death. Setka's body, stiff with the rigor of centuries, began to move. His hand shot out, gripping Menes's arm with a strength that belied his ancient form. "You dare disturb my rest?" Setka's voice was a harsh whisper, like the rustling of dead leaves. "You seek the power of the gods, but you are nothing more than a fool." Menes tried to pull away, but Setka's grip tightened, crushing the bones in his arm. Pain shot through Menes's body, and he screamed, the sound echoing through the empty halls of the temple. "Your blood has awakened me," Setka continued, "and for that, you will suffer as I have suffered." With a sudden, violent motion, Setka threw Menes across the chamber. The priest hit the wall with a sickening thud, his vision swimming with pain. He tried to rise, but Setka was upon him, his movements unnaturally fast for a man who had been dead for centuries. Menes watched in terror as the mummy began to change. The desiccated flesh on Setka's bones began to fill out, his skin growing taut and lifelike. The pharaoh was returning to the living world, but something was horribly wrong. The process was incomplete. Twisted by the forbidden ritual, Setka's face contorted in agony, his features warping into something monstrous. The chamber filled with the sound of Setka's enraged growls as he struggled against the incomplete resurrection. His body jerked and twisted, the ancient wrappings that bound him unraveling and turning to dust. Menes crawled backward, his mind racing for a way to escape. But there was no escape from the horror he had unleashed. Setka turned his gaze on Menes, his eyes burning with an unholy light. "You sought to cheat death, priest," he hissed. "Now you will share my curse." The pharaoh raised his hand, and the shadows in the chamber seemed to come alive, swirling around Menes like a storm. The darkness seeped into his skin, filling him with a cold that reached down to his soul. Menes screamed as his body began to wither, his life force draining away into the void. Setka's laughter echoed through the chamber, a sound that was more death than life. "You will never find peace, Menes. Your soul is mine, to torment for eternity." As the last of Menes' strength faded, he realized the terrible truth. He had not gained immortality. He had become a part of Setka's curse, trapped between life and death, doomed to suffer in the shadows of the afterlife. Setka, now fully restored to a twisted mockery of life, stepped over the priest's lifeless body. The Pharaoh's vengeance was only beginning. The ritual had awakened not just his spirit, but his hunger for revenge. Those who had dared disturb his slumber would pay with their lives and their souls. The temple doors creaked open, and Setka stepped out into the night, the desert winds howling like the cries of the damned. His mind was filled with memories of betrayal, of those who had conspired to bury his name and his power. He would find them, no matter how many centuries had passed, and he would make them suffer as he had suffered. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the once peaceful sands of Egypt began to stir with dark magic. The mummy's revenge had begun, and nothing would stand in the way of Setka's wrath.